Good morning. In 1904, this guy started to cause a stir in Wales. His name was Evan Roberts. He left school when he was 11 to become a coal miner, the same as his dad. At the age of 25, he began studying to become a minister and started practicing his preaching. The subsequent revival changed Wales and impacted the whole of Great Britain at that time. Something like 100,000 people were converted in Wales, approximately 1 million people across Britain. In the county of Glamorgan, convictions for drunkenness fell by almost 50% after the revival. Unfortunately, productivity at the coal mine also fell. The donkeys pulling the coal wagons could not understand the changed and cleaned up language and demeanour of the miners. And so these donkeys didn't know what to do when the miners started shouting at them. Newspaper accounts of the day and historians since attribute what happened in Wales and beyond to the work of the Holy Spirit. And today's readings tell us something about the story of the Spirit of God. So Eric started us on this journey a few weeks ago when he reminded us from the creation account in Genesis how that the Spirit of God brought order out of chaos. And there are many further references to the Spirit of God, God's Spirit, through the Hebrew Scriptures. The artistic director for the tent that was carried through the wilderness following the Exodus was said to be Spirit-infused. One of Moses' assistants, Bezalel, was granted wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and all kinds of skills by the Spirit of God, we read. Balaam was empowered to speak to the people of Israel by the Spirit of God. And we're going to be looking at Balaam's story next week. The Spirit of God anointed Kenaz as a leader during the time of the Judges. And the accounts of the lives of Moses, Gideon, Samson, King Saul, David, Ezekiel, all of these Old Testament characters contain references to the Spirit of God at work. It's important to understand the term, the word that we have for spirit now in the Hebrew is ruach. It's also been translated as wind or breath. We might also understand it as life force. The translators had to work out what ruach meant by carefully examining the context. In our New Testament, the Gospel of John records Jesus' prediction of the coming of the Spirit. So the notion of the Spirit of God was something that the disciples were familiar with when Jesus spoke about it. The early church began to understand the Spirit as an entity, and consequently the Council of Nicaea in 325 in the Common Era, after decades of debate, the church adopted the doctrine of the Trinity. One God, three persons, Father, Son, Spirit. So what about Pentecost? What's the connection? So the Hebrew people had these three great feasts, which were timed to coincide with the harvest seasons. Pilgrims to Jerusalem were required to bring the first part of each harvest to the temple. The Passover, they brought barley. The Festival of Weeks, they brought wheat. Festival of Tabernacles, olives and grapes. And our reading in Numbers today refers to the festival of the Feast of Weeks, which began 50 days after the feast of the Passover. So this is where the 50 come from, Pentecost, Penti 5. The typology is strong. Christian theologians link the first fruits of the Jewish festivals to this first group of converts, forming the initial spiritual harvest of the Christian church. So it might be correct then for us to call the day of Pentecost the birthday of the Christian church. So let's look at this day of Pentecost in Acts. We read in the first verse of chapter 2, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Our translation here doesn't really cut it. It's a much stronger word than together, than being in the same place at the same time. The Greek word occurs 12 times in the New Testament and 10 of them in the book of Acts. It contains the notion of intentionality, of combined purpose, on single-mindedness. So what were they single-minded about? Text doesn't specify. But I would like to suggest it definitely doesn't mean something like agreed on everything or had the same ideas and understanding about theology and doctrine and what worship should look like and what songs to sing. I think there was much more to it than that. They were just together in unity, oneness, living in harmony, but importantly, not living in uniformity. And I want to suggest this, that harmony consists of the intentionally embraced equilibrium within acknowledged tensions. Last week, Paul talked about unity in last week's in his sermon. How often do we hear that disunity is death? I'd like to propose that this togetherness that we read about at the beginning of this chapter in Acts was the basis of everything else that happened on that day. For us, we've been formed by the Enlightenment during the 17th, 18th centuries, where reason and logic and rationale emerged as the basis for understanding our world. We interpret our lives through facts and data and evidence. That's how we make meaning. We rely on the science. Plenty of evidence of that recently. Global warming, we looked at climate science. During COVID-19, we were constantly reassured by our politicians that they were being guided by medical science. The events of Acts 2 cannot be explained by science. Also, our brains are wired to make meaning, to join the dots. Finding the answer gives us security, makes us feel safe. Sometimes we join the dots too quickly and land on a conspiracy theory. It's hard for us to explain the logic of what's recorded here about that first Pentecost Sunday. In 1980, I was part of the leadership of a church, and a single mum came to see me with her 16-year-old son. I'll call him Jack. Jack had an inoperable tumour in his brain, not malignant, but growing. He'd lost the use of his right arm and hand and walked with difficulty because his right leg was failing. Jack and his mum told me they had been reading through the book of James in the New Testament and came across that chapter that discusses calling for the leaders of the church to pray with a person who was ill so that they could be healed. Jack and his mother wanted the leaders of that church to do just that. And so some weeks later, we had a special service for Jack. We anointed him with oil, as it suggests in that passage in James, and prayed for his healing. The tumour began to reduce in size and eventually it disappeared completely. Jack went on to study and become a nurse. He regained the full use of his arm and his leg. We know how important motor skills are in nursing, in the nursing profession. He became a great nurse. He was able to walk unimpeded. He worked for a time at the local private hospital here on the Redcliffe Peninsula. Now, even today, I do not understand what happened to Jack. It cannot be explained scientifically. It could not be explained medically by his doctor. We've all heard about spontaneous remission. However, we know that many people pray for healing, which does not come. So why Jack? And why then? And we might ask these same questions about that Pentecost Sunday in Acts 2. So just imagine Mr. and Mrs. Abrams are getting out of bed that morning and starting to prepare for the day and for the gathering that they're going to. And Mrs. Abrams says, "What do you think's going to happen today?" And Mr. Abrams stops, thinks for a moment and replies, "Well, first there'll be this mini tornado, and then for a while it probably will look like the building's about to burn down. And then there'll be a ruckus and everybody, all the neighbours will think that we've been out in the grog all night. Oh yeah, and it's Pete's turn to preach this week. So after he preaches, thousands of people are going to put up their hands and say they want to follow Christ." So you can just imagine this long silence, can't you? And finally Mrs. Abrams says, "I think it might be an idea if you go back to bed." If it says anything at all, Pentecost tells us that we cannot put God in a box. By my count, as we look at this chapter, the text indicates that there were 15 ethnic groups listening to Peter's sermon on that Pentecost Sunday. Imagine the cultural and national and philosophical and even religious differences between that group of people. Imagine how threatening it might have been for that little group of 120 to suddenly have 3,000 people, all of them different to you, land on your doorstep. Wouldn't it be natural for us to pull up the drawbridge, to batten the hatches, to protect us from them. And probably we would try and justify it by saying we need to keep our group pure and undefiled from these foreign forces. But what actually did happen in the text? This is what it says. Those who accepted Peter's message were baptised, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. They were all included. They were all welcomed in. They all became part of us. There are plenty of potential fault lines here at Redcliffe Uniting Church and in every church and in the wider church. There are plenty of issues that we could use to create an us and a them. There are plenty of possible excuses we could use to choose to exclude people and groups, to keep them out. Now, if we say we want a New Testament church, we will not find a rationale in Acts 2 to create a them. There is just us. Later in the chapter it says that they devoted themselves, the disciples devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer, praising God, enjoying the favour of all the people. So the early church began to develop its own liturgy, its own communal life, its own way of being. And as it did so, it had the favour of all the people. In a few short weeks, Redcliffe Uniting Church Hub is going to be open for business. My hope is that what we will see happening here on this campus, an extension, an ongoing work of the Spirit of God. And I want to suggest this, for that to happen, we need to be working together authentically in harmony. We will need to be ready to live with what we may not understand. We will need to be ready to accept difference. And as we do these things, may God grant us the privilege of having the favour of our community.